Thanks for coming. Um, I don't know what to say about people who show up at 10 o'clock in the morning to talk about life after doom. Before I really officially start this, can I just tell you, I live in Southwest Florida. My daughter-in-law sent me a card that said, live your life so that if you were a book, you would be banned in Florida. And I have a few, and one of the things I do there is that's just a joy in my life, is I'm a sea turtle monitor. So once a week, I'm part of a little group of people. We go out to a stretch of 7 miles of uninhabited barrier islands, and we keep track of all the sea turtle nests and all that sort of thing. It's great fun. But what that does is I meet people in Southwest Florida who care about the environment and believe that climate change is real, even though our governors won't let any state employee talk about that, which is another sign of Florida's uniqueness. And but most of my neighbors would not be in that category. And some of my neighbors recently, because they like me as a neighbor, read this book or started reading this book. And they've been looking at me really funny. And they invited me over for dinner the other night. And the husband said something to me like, I'm reading your book. Man, you are angry. And he was like, almost like he was scared of me now that I was so angry. Like, this isn't the Brian I know. And so I thought, this is not going to be a pleasant dinner. And when I was over to dinner, they were so nice to me, and they fed me such good food, and they were just sweet. And I realized they're worried about me. I guess they're so sure that I'm wrong that they are worried about me. So it was very sweet in a Florida kind of way. I thought what I would do is share maybe 3 ideas from the book in not too many minutes. And then I want to have time for some questions and comments. And then I just found out that one of my favorite human beings in the world, Ken Miedema, is going to improvise a song based on what he hears. And look, I just feel every time I'm with Ken and Bev, his manager of over 30 years, who's just a dear friend as well, whenever I'm with them, I just feel how blessed I am. I thought about it this morning. If you took the 10 peak musical experiences of my life, and I love music, like Ken has been involved in like at least 3 of them, I'm not kidding. There have been times where he's doing his music and I'm taken somewhere else. So we are so blessed, Ken, to have you here, my friend. I just love you, brother. So here's what I'd like to share. If you are very, very familiar with the climate crisis, you already know it is very, very bad. If you don't know a lot about it, just here's all you need to know. It's way worse than you think. But the climate crisis is only the tip of a very big, quickly melting iceberg. If it were just the climate crisis, it would be bad enough. But people sort of in the upper echelons of world leadership. I'm not talking about heads of state, but I'm talking about people who spend their lives trying to understand what's going on in the world and who try to do something about it other than win elections for their party. They've been arguing about which term to use, but the term that seems to be rising to the surface is the term polycrisis or metacrisis. And what's interesting to me to hear them do this, and this isn't to brag, this is just, this is just like interesting to me. Some of you know, I wrote a book in 2007, I think it came out in maybe somewhere around 2007, that was called Everything Must Change. And this was me as a guy who was becoming a little more, had been becoming gradually more aware. I had a question. My theological breakthrough had been, this is so obvious now, although there are millions of people who still would think this is crazy. My big theological discovery of my middle-aged years was that Jesus' primary message was not how to go to heaven after you die, but how to bring the kingdom of God to earth while we're alive. It wasn't, may we go to heaven after you die, it's, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Like, that's pretty obvious. But billions of people have been taught otherwise by the Christian religion for over 500 and the better part of 1,000 years, and maybe even 1,500 years. So this was a breakthrough thing for me. And so it raised the question, if God is concerned about what happens on planet Earth, not just extracting souls to go to heaven, if God's concerned about what happens on planet Earth, then I ought to be too. What's going on planet Earth? What are the biggest problems? What should we be concerned about? And so I left the pastorate in 2006. So this is my first chance to be a full-time writer and indulge in my love for research and interviewing experts and exploring my curiosity. And I threw myself into this project. And what I ended up with is saying, we don't just have one problem. We have an interlocking set of problems. And what's interesting to me now, again, not to brag, it's just like, it's kind of nice that I was somewhere in the right direction, almost 20 years ago, is that people today talking about the polycrisis say, yes, the climate change is the tip of a bigger iceberg that we could call overshoot. And if there's one new word to learn, that's the word to understand. Overshoot is a phenomenon that happens when you suck more out of your environment than the environment can replenish, and when you pump out more waste into the environment than the environment can detoxify. It's a very, very simple idea. Now, what has happened for the history of civilization? Let's say something like 3,000 years. Remember, most of human history, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and they would live in an area, and usually they would live in an area until they extracted all of its available protein. And then they would go to another area and where there was abundant protein. And while they were there, that previous area, their protein supplies would come back. Do you understand? So they didn't experience overshoot. There were relatively few of them. In fact, back then, for a long period of time, there wasn't just one human species. There was Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalis, and now Homo naledi and Homo denisovan, and so there were a variety of human species in different parts of the earth, relatively low in number, and they had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where they did not experience overshoot. But what happened then is we discovered agriculture. And when we discovered agriculture, it allowed us to stay in one place, produce an excess of calories, of starch, of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, so that we could produce more children that would survive, and we would eventually produce more children than could be sustained by the amount of land we had. Now, as soon as that happens, we would have local environmental overshoot. Does that make sense? And so then we would need to add more land or have a war and send off some people, and then they would go colonize. And there was plenty of land. But in the last couple of 100 years, we spread around the whole world. And so now we've reached a situation of not just local environmental overshoot, but of global overshoot. What that means is, every generation receives an earth that is somewhat impoverished compared to the previous generation. But here's the thing. The earth that generation receives is normal for them. That's the baseline. And so so when they die, they notice it's a little worse off than they inherited. They don't realize that this has been going on for long enough. It's actually a lot worse off, but it's only a little worse off. And then they die, and then they hand off, and then that baseline syndrome is what they call this, means that we don't even notice and feel the reality of overshoot. So when you understand that's a really, really big problem, then you say, well, how do we solve that problem? Well, it would be nice if we could find governments that could solve that problem. And that brings us to a second real serious problem. I know it's very hard to imagine this, but some of our governments are polarized. And there are a whole lot of reasons why they're polarized, but one of the reasons they're polarized is because we built an economic system 500 years ago, and really the roots of it go back farther, an economic system that requires economic growth. It requires us to get more land so that we can get more resources to produce more wealth, so that there's more money around, so that the poor people are not so poor they might go to war. Because when you get poor enough, you get desperate enough, you'll try some desperate stuff to get food for your children. You might have a migration to another place to live where there's enough food to keep your babies alive. You understand, when you become a migrant, it's not because you're a bad person, it's because you're a human being who loves your children, right? There are certain dangerous and vicious people well, actually, I'll get to that in a minute. So when you have people, when you have a shortage of resources for people, clean water, food, and all the rest, then you have inevitably a set of social problems that you need governments to solve. And the governments keep trying to solve them until they can't. And then when they can't, those unsolved problems create social unrest that then creates increased conflict, polarization, hate, fear. And all of that hate and fear and polarization, you may have never thought of it this way before, but it is a source of energy. When people are afraid, you can turn that fear. It's a little bit like turning crude oil into gasoline. You take their hunger and turn it into fear that they'll starve, and turn that fear into anger, and then turn that anger into blame. And it's like taking crude oil and refining it into a very powerful fuel. And whenever there's a source of energy, you can trust that there will be some life form that seizes on that source of energy. And we call the people who seize on the energy of hunger, leading to fear, leading to anger, leading to blame, we call those authoritarian leaders. They've been around for centuries. They're like an organism that is attracted to that set of emotions that are not bad emotions. They're just inevitable when you have certain conditions. They're artists. In fact, we have a word for them. We call them con artists because you know where the word con artist comes from. It comes from confidence, because they know that people who are hungry or afraid or angry or blaming, they are looking for someone with confidence who can tell them, I alone can fix this. It happens all through history. And we call that a con artist, because the person can't fix it, but they can exploit the energy for their own benefit. And so you put that set of things together. I mentioned the economic system. This is the last I'll say about this. Let me speak as a white American male some of my ancestors have lived in this country since the 1600s. I just found out through Ancestry.com. Our history, we define into antebellum and postbellum, before and after the Civil War. And we think that we solved slavery through the Civil War, through the North winning. We're seeing we didn't resolve the issue. But I have a suspicion that what we really did is we made a business decision. And the business decision was that coal and oil were better ways to get cheap energy than enslavement. So what happened is the institution of slavery became less profitable than the development of fossil fuels, like first coal, then oil, then gas. And in so doing, what we did is we created all the more trust in cheap energy being what keeps us going, which has made us more addicted to cheap energy. Because here's the thing. How did we end the Cold War? Did we prove that democracy was better than autocracy? I think what we really did is just that the so-called West was more effective at exploiting fossil fuels to produce more wealth faster so that they could promise more benefits to people than could be done by various forms of Marxism and so on. In the short run, it won. So here's what this means. It means that the underlying problems of class warfare and white supremacy and racism and all the rest didn't get dealt with. They just got bypassed so that we could provide more cell phones and cable TV stations and all the rest to keep people happy enough that they don't go to war with each other. Does that make sense? It's oversimplified, but I'll just tell you, because in the writing of this book, I met people, and since writing the book, more of them are coming to me, who are part of these kind of upper echelon discussions among people who really care about the world and are not primarily focused on winning the next election at any cost. And when they put all of these problems and a couple more that we haven't talked about together, what they say is we're in a polycrisis. And climate change is an obvious one, but it's not the only one, and it's not the deepest one. The deepest one is that we haven't figured out how to live with a sacred earth that has limits to it. Now, for all of us from religious backgrounds, our primal story is about a good and beautiful creation into which human beings emerge from the soil. And those human beings that emerge from the soil are told at the very beginning, there is abundance for you to enjoy, but there are limits. And if you go past those limits, baby, you're going to find out that there's this thing called evil. Because you're already in a good world. You know what good is. But if you want to find out what evil is too, go beyond the limits. Go beyond the limits of overshoot. Take more than this beautiful planet can give you. Pump out more waste than this beautiful planet can detoxify. And it's sort of interesting. I kind of think our sacred text was telling us some ecological wisdom, and we developed systematic theologies to make sure we didn't notice it, so the people who paid money to keep our religious institutions going could keep making money by exploiting the earth and practicing overshoot. And they didn't even necessarily do that consciously. They did it because all of us, myself included, don't realize the degree to which we haven't addressed our our inner distortions in how we survive. And I don't have to blame anybody or hate anybody. I just have to say, our species has a problem right now. And I think we're coming to the place where if we don't, well, we're already past the time. We had plenty of opportunities to learn our lesson and wake up. And so we're going to have some consequences for that. So that first thing I want to say is our problem is this polycrisis. Now then people say, well, what's going to happen? Can I say that's a really dangerous question? Because when you ask what's going to happen, what you're saying is something's going to happen and my job is to adjust to it. And you understand, when you, in your mind, you're thinking, how do I adjust to it? How do I make the best of it? You're already surrendering your own agency as to what happens. This is what Paulo Freire used to say in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, that oppressed people, if all they worry about is how to survive, which is all you can worry about when you're really on the edge of survival, he said, look, part of raising people's consciousness or awareness is to help them become protagonists in the drama of their own lives, protagonists in their own story, to regain their agency, to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? And all of us are struggling with this right now. How do we regain our agency? Okay, that's the problem. But when people say, what's going to happen? Here's the honest answer. Nobody knows exactly. And one of the things I tried to do in this book is I try to lay out 4 scenarios of what could happen. I'll tell you from the beginning that I do not think it is wise to settle on any of these 4 scenarios. As far as I know, nobody knows which of these 4 are going to happen. But I'm pretty sure, I haven't had anybody argue with me that what will happen is not one of these 4. So here they are. And the big issue is what our civilization, our global human civilization, where almost, I'm only saying almost because somebody might come and say, well, what about this 3 square miles somewhere? So I'm going to say almost, but it's probably not really almost. But almost every local economy is woven into a global economy. And so that global economy is so interlocked. The joke you might hear is when the American economy gets a cold, the global economy, has a heart attack or something like that, right? That our economies are interwoven. Now it would be if the Chinese economy, struggles, collapses, the global economy would be devastated by this, right? All of our local economies are woven into national, regional, and global economies so that we live in this global economy. Let's call that global economy the global civilization. Because the economy, in a certain sense, the global economy now is a larger reality than any nation state. And the nation state, in many ways, develops its policies to try to help it keep surviving in this global economy. Which, by the way, when people say America first, what you might think, I think part of what they want is there some way for us to be able to just get our own act together and work in our own country to make it better. But what they don't understand is it's way too late for that. We're part of a global economy. That's a nostalgia for a world that, is, for now at least, gone. Another whole story about the future. So here are the 4 scenarios in that setting. First scenario I call collapse avoidance. That we're heading toward a collapse, because if the environment has a collapse, if it starts costing us more than our economic systems can sustain, we start seeing how fragile our economic systems are. A pandemic can give a pretty big jolt. A set of dishonest bankers can give it a really huge jolt. What happens when sea levels rise? What happens when the intensity and number of storms keeps rising? What happens when certain places become uninhabitable, either for people or crops that people depend on? So mass migrations happen. And when you look at those blows, the first scenario is, yes, the blows will be great, but the global civilization will find a way to avoid collapsing. That's scenario one. Scenario two is collapse, rebirth, that there will be a collapse. The thing is too fragile to sustain. And after the collapse, which will cause a lot of pain and a lot of death and a lot of challenge, and the people who are poorest will suffer far more, but the rich are going to suffer as well. There will be a collapse, but there will be something that can be reborn from the collapse. And we might hope that what would be reborn would learn lessons from what happens on the way down, so that what would be reborn could possibly be an ecological civilization, a civilization that knows how to live with the earth. So the first one is collapse avoidance. We steer out of this mess we're in, and we become a more ecological civilization. Second is there's a collapse, but we come out of it. Hopefully something rises from a very, very difficult period and into an ecological civilization. Third is collapse and survival. And this scenario is there's a collapse, and some percentage of people survive, but they probably will not survive at the level of they surely will not survive at the level of our current civilization. It will be fewer people, and they will have a standard of living that maybe is like pre-modern times, right? Because the infrastructure of the modern world is so expensive to maintain in terms of money and environmental stability. That's scenario three, collapse, survival. And then the fourth is collapse, extinction. And the way this scenario works is that on the way down, the different nations of the world reach a point where they say, I don't care how many people get killed to keep us alive a little bit longer. And if enough nations, especially with nuclear weapons, do that sort of thing, and by the way, everyone's eyes are on what's happening in Gaza right now, where one group of people seems to be saying, we are willing to kill an unlimited number of other people to increase our security. And we Americans might be upset about this. Some of us might be upset, but we have to remember how many people we killed in Iraq in this century to give ourselves the feeling of being safer. And the statistics were much worse for what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the idea that people are saying, I don't care the death toll over there if it leads to a better outcome for me. If enough of that happens, you can imagine a scenario where things unravel to the point where we're not talking only about human extinction, but we're talking about probably a lot of vertebrate life in the land and the seas being gone at the end of that. Not only the initial disaster of a lot of nuclear bombs and so on, but, and by the way, the other untold results of untended nuclear reactors and all that. You just imagine what happens when things get bad enough. Then you have to picture an Earth that goes through a human asteroid hitting. 4 scenarios. Sorry to tell you this early in the morning. A lot of you already have been thinking about this, but here's the warning I want to give you. What I noticed in myself when I started engaging in this and processing this and trying to look into all the details of it is my brain only wants to go to 2 of those scenarios. I either want to say, we'll have collapse avoidance, everything is fine, or it will be collapse, extinction. There's nothing we can do. Now, obviously, I don't really like any of these scenarios, but I certainly don't like that fourth one. Why would my brain be attracted to it? And here's what I noticed, just I'm observing. Those are the two scenarios that require nothing of me. Everything's going to be fine, so I can just relax and continue watching Netflix. I can just relax and continue making money. I can relax and just continue singing praise songs. Whatever my thing is, I can keep doing that. Or I say, it's hopeless. Might as well have a good time while it lasts. And what I notice about those is, returning to Paulo Freire, I cease to become a protagonist in my own narrative. I am now just going along for the ride. I've surrendered my agency. So that was the second thing that I thought I would share. Third thing is whatever of these scenarios unfolds, it's not going to be easy. And it's going to require virtues that aren't just nice to give us a shiny social image. It's going to be virtues that become necessary for survival. For example, if you actually depend on other people, you have to choose who you're going to depend on. And you can only depend on people who tell the truth. In our current culture, you could get really, really rich and powerful by lying. But when you're in a tough time, you need to know people will tell you the truth. Does that ring true? Does that make sense? Look, in this culture, you can go far by being a heartless person who only cares about yourself. But when you go into hard times, you need compassionate and kind people who will watch out for each other and will consider your well-being super important. You need faithful people. You need generous people. You need people who want to be peaceful and not violent, who want to create islands of peace and sanity in a world that's going bonkers and is totally dysregulated. Speaking of regulation, you need people who know how to self-regulate. You need people who know how to find some measure of inner peace to be able to keep their heads and stay who they are and not forget who they are. And suddenly it sounds like you need people who have a really healthy spirituality. Like right now, the word Christian means any number of contradictory things. But in the old sense of being Christian, generous, kind, honest, moral, faithful, like we're actually going to need some of those kinds of people. And we had a term for practices of self-regulation. They were called spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines. We're going to need communities that can teach people those practices when you're really working hard to stay regulated day after day after day. Shoot. I felt like that during that debate a couple weeks ago. And, so suddenly the need for spiritual communities is going to really, really grow. And right at the point where a whole lot of people are just giving up on the whole thing, by the way, not just in Christianity. The struggles we have in Christianity are going on in Judaism, they're going on in Hinduism, they're going on in Buddhism. They're going on. They're human problems because we all have the same hardware and very, very similar software in these soft animal bodies of ours. And so suddenly our spirituality is going to matter more than ever, but not as a nice accoutrement. Like, what do you do for a person who has everything? Give them some spirituality. No, suddenly spirituality becomes a set of survival practices to help us not only live, but live well, no matter what the times are. And so when I wrote this book, I didn't plan to do this, but as I was watching myself struggle to self-regulate and more deeply understanding what I call our current civilization, that's the term I used instead of polycrisis, I ended up building the chapter titles around the practices that I think we're going to really, really need. And so, you know how sometimes people who write, they do a reading? I'm just going to read you the chapter titles, and then we'll open up for some questions and discussion. So a reading from my table of contents. This is true. I've never thought my table of contents was worth reading before, and it might not be now, but I'll share with you what I have. Here they are. These are kind of like things I can say to myself. I am waking up. Welcome to reality. Mind your mind. Send in the poets. When the story does harm, step away. Hope is complicated. Learn to see. Seek indigenous wisdom. Don't read the Bible in the same old way. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. I am a candle. Start with step one. We are not the first ones here. Imagine safe landings and new beginnings. It only takes 2 or 3. When life gets tough, we get tougher. Beauty abounds. What a time to be alive. Tell them about the dream. Find your light and shine it. We make the way by walking. Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes, 7 minutes for some questions, and then I'm going to turn it over. Yes? Right. And if you can make your questions super brief and say it loud, but I'll repeat it. Yeah.
Really quick, I just wanted to say, like, the last thing you closed with gave me so much hope. Yeah. But, like, the whole beginning, I was like, oh, shit, we're completely fucked. And I feel like that's a biblical story, too. We get this, it's awesome. Oh, shit, we're completely fucked. And then at the end, it's, like, awesome. And I'm wondering if, and I've learned this, I feel like, from you with the new kind of Christian, where my journey really started. Thank you. But what if we just changed our words so that instead of collapse avoidance, we say cooperative avoidance, cooperative rebirth, cooperative survival, and cooperative extinction. It's a small shift in our language that allows the punchline to be the table of contents.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that comment, and you might be right. You might be right. It may have been a tactical error for me to use that language and that approach. I don't know, but thanks. That might be better. Yes.
I'm with a group of churches that got together a few years ago and created an organization that's trying to raise awareness about climate change. And I have been a leader in that organization for several years, and so people send me lots of articles. So I've been going through this climate grief journey
Yes.
for a long time. And our Sunday school is now reading your book. And what I'm finding is a lot of people in the class are overwhelmed. It's called Life After Doom, and he gets to the doom right away. But I just want to say to you that because I've been on this journey for such a long time, am very relieved by your book, because somebody is finally
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Yes, so let me just make a comment, because really these two first comments, I think, are really reflect my experience these however many weeks since the book came out. I wrote this book primarily for the people who are already aware and are on the verge of going to scenario 4 and just say there's no hope, why even try? Those are the people who I felt I cared about most, in some ways because I felt myself being pulled in that direction myself. And almost all of those people say to me, what a relief, right? But then a lot of other people feel, as my brother here said, gosh, do you need to come on that strong? Like my neighbors, wow, you are angry. And I think that's very, very legitimate. But maybe I'll just quote Greta Thunberg, who in fact, a lot of people have gotten mad at Greta because she's not just a kid doing something cute. She is pissed off, and she is, speaking truth to power. But she said, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, people always tell me, oh, you give me so much hope. She says, I don't want you to have hope. I want you to panic because the house is on fire. And panic obviously can have a lot of negative consequences too. But I think there is a certain part of this that is disruptive. And my approach is not the only approach. And I'm glad for all kinds of other people who take other approaches as well. But thank you. I'm going to go really fast here. Yes. And let's try to make these sort of lightning round. Yeah.
A different type of approach. I work a lot with low-income and poor.
Yes.
I also work with climate group. Our difficulty when talking to people is to say, we can't worry about what's going to happen in 10 years,
Yes.
15 years. We've got to focus on change now,
Yes.
even at the small level.
Yes.
Trying to get them involved in this.
Yes. Let me say something about that. So I will repeat the question. The question was, look, so many people are in such desperate need, and you tell them we've got this climate crisis. In the first chapter of the book, I say to a whole lot of people, this book isn't for you. You've got so many other problems you're dealing with. You deal with your problems. This book is for the people who already are worried about this problem, right? So, and this is one of our big challenges right now. We've got to learn that there are good ways to respond to problems that are different from each other, and there are different problems to focus on. And when you get so focused on the problem you're worried about the most, that you think is the most important, and you get mad at everybody else for not joining you in your problem, look, can I tell you something? People don't want to join you in your problem if you're so mad. So you have to be able to be gracious toward people who are doing things different. Yes, I think I'm only going to be able to do 2 more. So let's go here and then here. I'm so sorry. Yes.
You spoke at our church at the rich white.
Hey, can you make this a really short question?
It looks to me like we are trying to free the slaves, but it looks like we're trying to enslave everyone else on the planet to keep our lifestyle in check.
Okay.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So. One way to think about the era of slavery in this country is that a group of rich white people, remember, it wasn't all white people who were, there were a whole lot of poor white people too, but there was some rich white people who wanted to increase their riches and maintain their riches through the enslaving of other people. And the question now comes, how much more enslavement are people willing to impose, not only on other people, but on all of our fellow creatures? You imagine if somebody could make a deal with the leaders of this world and say, to keep the GDP at its current rate, would you be willing to have all the coral reefs in the world die? I think a whole lot of people would say, of course. How about half of the existing forests? I never go there anyway. Who cares? So these are the kinds of questions. And by the way, this is why if you want to give up on religion, okay, but who's going to be left to raise a moral voice for the forests and the coral reefs? I don't think big business is going to do it. I don't think politicians are going to do it. Well, I'm so sorry. Our time is up, and I want Ken to have a chance to bless us in some way now. We love you, Ken. Thank you.